Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are referencing the Johnson edition, and we turn now to poem 488, Myself Was Formed, a Carpenter. Another poem about being a poet, much like the previous poems we've just studied, 486 and 487. Carpenter referenced in 486 and 487, not directly, but more indirectly. In other words, whatever house it is that Emily is talking about living in 486, it was built by someone. So what Emily's going to do in this poem is play a game of saying, in the same way that a house is constructed or built by a carpenter, I myself am also a carpenter, only obviously now of words, not of wood, if you wish to think of it that way. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments, as well as our preceding 487 poems. We just finished, as we said, with 487, You Love the Lord. And if you've done that reading already, then you know that one of Emily's favorite metaphors for writing is often building. And here, of course, we can think about the whole influence of the Freemasons in American thought and the like, although apparently no connection ever made between the Freemasons and Emily. We don't know what she would think about that. But clearly, she's very interested in building here. By the way, we should just pause that her contemporary Walt Whitman was himself raised on construction sites and fancied himself a carpenter as well. She'll say it this way. Notice it's not I, it's myself. Myself was formed a carpenter, an unpretending time. My plane and I together wrought before a builder came to measure our attainments. Had we the art of boards sufficiently developed, he'd hire us at halves. My tools took human faces, the bench where we had toiled against the man persuaded. We temples build, I said. Now this is classic Emily. On first reading, it's often difficult to know exactly what she's saying and what's up with all the dashes. It's as if she's somehow, can we say it out loud without laughing too loud, she's building something even in this poem, building possibly an argument that we could say. In other words, she wants to think about who she is and her identity as a carpenter, as a poet. Now, of course, notice this idea of being formed or crafted. So right away, her selection of this verb is fascinating. She myself was formed. I myself would probably be the way we would say it, right? A carpenter. Now, again, carpenter is a fascinating choice of word. You'll, of course, make the reference that in Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6:3, we are reminded that Jesus Christ was born the son of a carpenter. And in that regards, of course, building is central to our study of Christ's theological views, and Emily's playing around with that idea as well. When we saw poem 243, you'll remember that she said, I've known a heaven like a tent, to wrap its shining yards, pluck up its stakes, and disappear without the sound of boards, or rip of nail, or carpenter, but just the miles of stair that signalize a show's retreat in North America. When we get to poem 1142, by the way, she'll mention carpenter in 1123. When we get to 1142, she'll say it this way, the props assist the house until the house is built, and then the props withdraw, and adequate, erect, the house support itself in, cease to recollect the augur and the carpenter. Just such a retrospect hath a perfected life, a past of plank and nail and slowness, then the scaffolds drop, affirming it a soul. It's a beautiful construction of how a life is built, one small slat plank at a time. She'll say, I was formed a carpenter, and then she'll say it, an unpretending time. I find this a fascinating use of this word, unpretending. It's her only time in all her poetry that she uses it. And we could argue this is back when she maybe thought nothing of publishing. In other words, I wasn't interested in publishing back then. My plane, now she'll use the language of building, right, in construction. My plane and I together. Notice this idea that there's a joining together of two different things. The tool that she's building with, and then her own creative act, her thoughts. And I together wrought before a builder came. Notice capitalized. Notice it's not carpenter, it's a builder. So we've got this distinction between the carpenter, the one who's building something, and the builder. And all of a sudden there seems to be a certain kind of hierarchy at play here before the builder came. Now, are we talking here about a newspaper person, possibly Sam Boyles, who shows up, arrives to maybe say, we can publish some of your stuff, and now all of a sudden we're engaged in this activity with the publishing world? Is that what she's talking about? Clearly she's not talking about building a house. To our knowledge, Emily never picked up a hammer to build a house, okay? Although she watched her houses being built, right? Especially, advanced upon, right? Older houses fixed up and that kind of thing. To measure our attainments, think about Song of Myself 46, I know I have the best of time and space and was never measured and never will be measured. To measure our attainments, I should just point out, Walt Whitman is, as we've said in our lectures at learnstrong.net, where we did all the poems of Leaves of Grass, Whitman loved the idea of building as writing, and he talked about measuring and the like. To measure our attainments, it's an interesting word because we're from an unpretending time now to attainments. In other words, how good is my stuff? We've seen this in a number of her poems already. Had we the, notice capitalized art, had we the art of boards sufficiently developed, and again, sufficiently takes us back to attainments and to unpretending. In other words, is it good enough? He'd hire us. Who is the he? Is it Sam Boyles? We don't know. He'd hire us. And then now we're back to tools. My tools took human faces. In other words, I shared my stuff. Is that what she's saying? I shared my stuff with somebody else, maybe Sam Boyles. The bench where we had toiled, notice the pronoun we, where we had toiled against the man. I'm sorry, capitalized M for man. What man? Which men? Is she talking about the publishing world? Dash, persuaded, if we had persuaded the man, we, temples build, I said. The syntax, of course, is as often the case with Emily. It's convoluted. Notice this I said takes us back to the idea of chats with Emily. I can't help but read this idea of temples built and think about Thoreau's at the conclusion of Walden. If you have built castles in the air, that is where they belong. Now, put the foundations under them. The idea that your life is constructed in some way like a temple. By the way, notice it's temple, it's not church. And again, some have pointed out, they call the Masons' reference to their house of worship a temple. So is she playing around with that idea? Who is to say? Now, when we get to poem 1142, as we've already said, we're going to come back to this idea. What about poem 709 that we've referenced already in earlier discussions of 486 about publishing? Where one more time she says it, publication is the auction of the mind of man. Poverty be justifying for so foul a thing. It's obvious Emily doesn't think of publishing as something she wants, possibly, but we would rather from our garret go, here it's garret, not temple, white, under the white creator, than invest our snow. In other words, innocent, might we say, unpretending. In other words, I didn't want to share my stuff with just anybody. Maybe she had a sense that the temple she was constructing would not be properly appreciated in its time. We know that is probably true by virtue of the fact that it took a long time for anybody to look at these poems and go, dude, there's something seriously constructive about what we're looking at. Thought belonged to him who gave it, then to him who bare. Its corporal illustration sell the royal air. Again, this idea of castles in the air comes to mind with Thoreau in the temple. In the parcel, be the merchant of the heavenly grace, but reduce no human spirit to disgrace of price. Okay, in other words, she was building this temple, but for what? Very interesting. How are we going to read a poem like this at 2A? I think her argument is that the true builder knows there's something profound and sacred, important in the construction process. At 2B, obviously, the building metaphor comes to mind. At 3A, we mentioned poem 709 on why Emily never really wanted to publish her stuff. I think of Natalie Goldberg's classic. For those of us who love to write, we love Natalie Goldberg's stuff, Writing Down the Bones and Wild Mind. I can't recommend two books of greater importance in the lives of so many of my students in room 303 about writing and the approach to writing as Writing Down the Bones and then Wild Mind. Both of them are brilliant, brilliant books, and I would recommend them to all of you. Natalie Goldberg, a lover of Emily Dickinson, by the way, we should point out. Finally, at 3B, how is writing for you like building a temple, a construction, something that is sacred? Maybe Emily's challenging you to think differently about writing. I hope so. Thank you.